Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Massive news coming out of the transfer portal this Sunday night as former five-star defensive lineman Walter Nolen entering his name into the transfer portal. We're talking about a true difference maker on that inside of the defensive line. In that 2022 class was the number 2 overall prospect, the number 1 defensive lineman in that recruiting cycle, and the guy that had 4.5 sacks, 8 tackles for a loss as a sophomore in his second year at the college level. Want to talk a little bit about what Walter Nolen brings to the college football field, but more importantly, what everyone wants to talk about, where are some potential landing spots that make the most sense for a guy like Walter Nolen? And he's going to be a dude that's getting a ton of interest from coaches all across the country. This is one of the more talented defensive linemen we see in college football. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys. A special shout out as the transfer portal opens up. I'm going to be doing my very best to keep track of all these roster moves. The amount of support you guys have shown, it really does mean a lot. Your support allows me to do something that I absolutely love doing. Cannot thank you guys enough. If you do enjoy the content, you want to support the boys, consider subscribing to the channel. And more importantly, the best part about this, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. What destinations make the most sense for Walter Nolen? We'll chop it up there. I'll give you guys my top 3 landing spots for Walter Nolen. Without further ado, let's get into this one. Talking about Walter Nolen first, there's a reason he was the number 2 prospect in that 2022 class. The athleticism for a body that size is just different, and you see that on the football field at the college level as well. In that 2023 season, this is a guy that 4.5 sacks, 8 tackles for a loss, 37 total tackles. What he might lack in size on that inside of the defensive line, you're not talking about a guy that's over 310 pounds. He more than makes up with the quickness that he has, and the play strength is certainly there. I mean, you see like what some of the adjectives that you use to describe Walter Nolen and what you saw from him in his only second year at the college football level. Penetrator, phenomenal athlete, great first step. He's a guy that lives in opponents' backfields. You talk about creating negative plays, creating havoc on the quarterback, having a guy that can stop the run but also rush the passer, a rare dual quality for an interior defensive lineman. Walter Nolen's a guy that has that, and he allows you to not really have to sub him out. I mean, a lot of times you got your run stopping personnel on the inside, and then when it gets to 3rd and long, you're subbing someone out to go get after the passer. Walter Nolen's a 3-down defensive lineman. He's a guy that can create tackles for a loss on 1st and 2nd down on those run plays. And when it is time to pin his ears back and get after the quarterback, a first step that is different on the inside. And you can just tell a lot of guards and centers have a difficult time dealing with Walter Nolen, not only his quickness off the ball, but his speed to power in terms of getting into the chest of opposing interior offensive linemen. It's kind of at a different level. And that's kind of the reason he's going to be one of the more coveted guys in this transfer portal. Talking about some schools that would make sense for Walter Nolen, you got to go back to what he was coming out of the high school ranks. His top 3 schools, Texas A&M, Tennessee, Georgia, obviously from the state of Tennessee. You got to be thinking about the Tennessee Vols, and this kind of highlights the importance of not burning bridges on the recruiting trail, right? You miss out on a guy like Walter Nolen. If you're Georgia, you're Tennessee, you're trying to keep those relationships strong because you never know which guys are going to be coming back around looking for a new landing spot at the college football level. We're about to see a ton of talent get entered in the transfer portal, and it kind of is a reminder to a lot of fans too. If a kid doesn't commit to your school coming out of high school, I mean, there's no reason to go in. There's no reason at all, in period, to go after a kid on Twitter, on Instagram, in terms of not choosing your school. But for coaches and recruiters, you're trying to maintain those relationships, because there's a very likely chance that that kid ends up in the transfer portal 1, 2, 3 years down the road, and you want to still have those relationships inbound. And if Tennessee or Georgia, one of those top 3 schools, continued those relationships, they probably have the inside track in terms of recruiting Walter Nolen out of the transfer portal. Now, looking at some landing spots at the Georgia Bulldogs, it makes a lot of sense. Kirby Smart went into the year saying, this is a year where we don't feel like we have a difference maker on the defensive line, specifically on the inside of that defensive line. I think a lot of Georgia fans, we saw that in the SEC championship game in terms of not being able to stop the run, like we're used to seeing the Georgia Bulldogs, not being able to get after the passer, like we're used to seeing from this Georgia defense. There was no Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt. Walter Nolen could be that guy. And you look at the personnel, good chance you're losing Warren Brinson, Zion Stackhouse, guys who played a lot of football for the Georgia Bulldogs. And yes, they do have Jamal Jarrett, Jordan Hall kind of waiting in the wings. Walter Nolen's a guy that comes into the Georgia program and is an immediate impactor for this Georgia defense. And again, was included in this top 3 school. This is a year where NIL is going to play a role, but he's going to want to go to a school where he can get developed and become a top 10 NFL draft pick. They ain't better school than the Georgia Bulldogs at getting those interior defensive linemen ready, developed, and going to the NFL, right? Jordan Davis, Jalen Carter. You talk about the Devontae Wyatt. This is a program that's proven to develop interior defensive linemen. The Georgia Bulldogs certainly would make a lot of sense. And you look at that defensive line, allowed 3.8 yards per carry. That's 39th in the country. Only sacked the quarterback 6.8% of the time on dropbacks. That was 51st in the country. Those numbers from the Georgia defensive line, not necessarily what you're used to. I would not be surprised at all if Kirby Smart is picking up the phone tomorrow morning and getting in contact with Walter Nolen. Next school you want to talk about, Tennessee. Obviously, if he wants to go closer to home from the state of Tennessee, that would make a lot of sense. Tennessee becoming more of a destination for guys in the front seven. This was the best front seven we've seen from the Tennessee Vols since Josh Heupel's been there. You might lose a guy like Norman Lott. You might lose a guy like Amari Thomas. Walter Nolen is coming in and being a difference maker immediately for Tennessee. Obviously, a hometown kid. This one would make a lot of sense. The last school, I got 2 more schools I want to talk about. A sneaky one that wasn't necessarily involved in Walter Nolen when he was coming out of high school, but I could certainly see getting in this race, and that's the Ohio State Buckeyes. You look at that inside of the defensive line, Tyleik Williams, Michael Hall Jr., Ty Hamilton, all guys that probably might be going to the NFL draft after this season, leaving kind of a void in terms of difference makers on that inside of the defensive line. Ohio State, an NIL powerhouse, certainly could be making a play for Walter Nolen. And you look at the evidence of development on that inside of the defensive line. They're about to send 3 guys to the NFL. Walter Nolen's looking at that Ohio State defense, guys like Larry Johnson and Jim Knowles, and saying, this is a spot where I could be a difference maker, play for a national title, and get noticed by the NFL. Ohio State makes a lot of sense. And you got to throw in a school like USC, right? USC, we've talked about this time and time again. They are trying to get more physical on the defensive line as they move into the Big Ten. They tried in the transfer portal last year, like Bear Alexander, Anthony Lucas from the same class as Walter Nolen. There's no doubt in my mind USC is going to be making a strong push for Walter Nolen out of the transfer portal. It seems like a perfect fit. You pair Bear Alexander, Walter Nolen, you're suddenly feeling a little bit different about the inside of that defensive line. Sean Nua recruited Walter Nolen when he was at Michigan out of high school. And if Sean Nua is retained on this staff, it would make a lot of sense for the USC Trojans to be going after Walter Nolen. Another school that just kind of popped into my mind, the Texas Longhorns, about to lose a guy like Tavondre Sweat. You about to lose a guy like Byron Murphy, about to lose a guy like Alfred Collins, all guys that were difference makers on that inside of the defensive line. Texas might not be in portal mode yet because they got a lot more to play for. Certainly could be a team that's in play for Walter Nolen. At the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of programs that are going to be looking for the service of Walter Nolen. Those are some schools that would make sense for me. That would be, I think, make sense for Walter Nolen as well. Let me know in the comment section. Obviously, a ton of programs that could be included in this list. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.